Thank you so much for having me. Some tough acts to follow here. And Debbie really teed me up for part of this, so I can't wait to show you all of this. All right, so I'm going to talk today about hope in lung cancer, which just so happens to be a topic I know an obscene amount about because I did my dissertation on it. So the first time that I met Cheryl, I don't know how we got on this topic, and she started talking about hope, and I was like, talking about the theory, and I was like, actually, I know a lot about this. And she was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to have you come talk about this. So now is my time. And thank you for the kind introduction. Nice to see so many of my MUSC colleagues here. No disclosures to report. And I am a person who practices what I preach. If you've seen me talk before, I do this every time. We're gonna all take a little mindful minute together. So you've been sitting for a while, so if you would like to stand up, you are welcome to. If not, I would invite you to just sit up really straight in your chair, plant your feet firmly on the ground. I see some standers, I love it. Same thing, so if you're standing, you wanna kind of have an open posture, right? Arms nice and open by your sides. If you're sitting, hands can be resting down or palms facing up. And you can either close your eyes or just have a nice softened downward gaze. And we're gonna just spend 30 seconds focusing on a sensation of the breath. So you can focus on the sensation of the temperature of the air going in and out of your nose or your mouth, or you can focus on the sensation of breath rising and falling in your belly. If your mind wanders, which it will, that is fine, just bring it back to the breath. All right, welcome back. Thank you for indulging me. This always helps me get a little talk jitters out, and it's a nice kind of introduction shift in topic, hopefully. All right, so we're gonna talk about hope. First, here's a little outline for our plan today. We're gonna talk about what hope is. I'm gonna introduce you to a theory about hope. I'm gonna tell you why hope and optimism are not the same thing, even though we sometimes use them interchangeably. Then I'm going to show you some research, the research that I talked about from my dissertation, looking at specifically at hope in patients with advanced lung cancer. And then I want to leave you with a couple of practical strategies for how you can foster hope in the context of lung cancer. All right, so we throw around the word hope all the time in cancer. I actually walked downstairs this morning because I had noticed this before, but I had not taken a picture. This is actually on the wall at Hollings Cancer Center. It's this Emily Dickinson quote about hope. And then on the right, this was actually a plaque at Moffitt Cancer Center where I did my dissertation research that also includes the word hope. And these are like lovely, beautiful quotes, but unfortunately I'm a researcher and I can't study these like soft constructs. So we have to go to Merriam-Webster here, who says that hope is a desire accompanied by expectation of obtaining what is desired, or a belief that it is attainable. So you want something to happen, or maybe you want something not to happen, and you believe that that is possible. So Rick Snyder was a researcher back in the 70s, 80s, and in the 1980s, he was on his sabbatical from the University of Kansas, and he became really interested in kind of establishing a formal definition of hope. And so he interviewed people that he identified, I don't know how, as hopeful, and he asked them to describe how they thought about their lives. And what he found is that there were three kind of common attributes to the descriptions that people gave. So the first thing was goals, the what. So he found that these people all had something or some things to be hopeful for. He also found that all of these people had what he called agency thinking. This is kind of the motivation, the capacity to be able to pursue your goals, the will. And an example of an agency thought would be, I meet the goals I set for myself. And then finally, pathways thinking is the ways to get there. So your ability to kind of construe strategies to be able to reach your goals. And these things are thought to be dynamic, so they kind of interact with one another over time. Maybe a pathway doesn't work, you have to find a new one. Maybe your agency, fluctuates. And so he thought that hope was really a cognitive thing, which I think sometimes we think of it as an emotion, which it can be, but he really posited that this was a cognitively based motivation model of goal attainment. He did a lot of research on hope, and he found that kind of across the board in general samples, greater hope associated with more positive outcomes, greater resilience, greater quality of life, and less negative outcomes, less depression, less anxiety, etc. He also found that hope was generally a trait-based construct, so something dispositional. So I love that Debbie reframed what that doctor had put in her chart about an unfortunate person. No, something unfortunate happened to you, right? That's an example of dispositional versus situational. So Snyder thought that hope was largely a trait-based construct. So you would have the same levels of hope across different situations, like a cancer diagnosis, but that there is some state element. So you might vary and fluctuate a little bit within a kind of set band. All right, so hope versus optimism. I think sometimes we use these words interchangeably, but they are different. So optimism is really the expectation that the future will be good. These two other researchers, Shire and Carver, did a lot of research on optimism. So this is kind of this generalized belief that the glass is half full. And one thing that makes it different is that you have this general belief that things are going to turn out well, kind of independent of what you do personally. That's kind of different from hope, right? This belief that you have a personal ability to kind of move in a positive direction given the realities of a situation. The thing about hope is that it can then exist no matter what the circumstances, which I think is really important. Research does show that these concepts are correlated, but they are empirically distinct, which means they are different. All right, so when we think about hope in lung cancer, and Adam set the stage nicely here, so I will not talk too much about this, but if our goal is to extend survival, there's a lot to be hopeful for, right? So this was an article that came out in 2020 that showed that overall lung cancer mortality was dropping thanks to decreases in smoking and increases in different new treatment availability. I always think looking at the increase in 5-year survival rates for non-small cell lung cancer is so impressive, right? We see that in the last 20 years, that 5-year survival rate has nearly doubled. And I love this caveat that accompanies those rates on the American Cancer Society website that really tells us these numbers don't take into account everything, especially with actionable mutations and things like that, and that these numbers are old, right? So these might actually even be changing right now. There needs to be an updated diagram of this as well. Somebody over there do it. But I think this really nicely shows kind of the huge kind of jolt that we had in new availability of treatments over the last 20 years, particularly with targeted therapies and immunotherapy. So lots to be hopeful for if our goal is to extend survival. So for my dissertation study, which I did about 6-7 years ago now, I was really interested in studying factors that might be associated with positive psychological outcomes in lung cancer. We know a lot about things that are associated with worse outcomes, right? Physical symptom burden, function limitations, uncertainty about the future. But there's not so much looking at what might be associated with better outcomes. And so I was really interested in hope as a positive psychological construct that might help to explain how people cope well in the context of living with lung cancer. And so this is kind of a simplified model of what I was looking at, but now that you all are experts in hope and you know that hope is a goal-based model of motivational attainment, goals are in the middle here. So we wanted to see if hope was associated with goals, and if goals were associated with psychological outcomes, if hope was associated with psychological outcomes, and then we did a mediation model to see if we put all this together. So really trying to kind of see in a lung cancer population, did this kind of ring true, like in general patient samples without cancer? And here's a brief overview of the study structure. I'll go into a little more detail here, but we recruited patients. I was at Moffitt Cancer Center for my graduate degree, and so we had people fill out some measures, including Snyder's Hope Theory, and then I did a semi-structured interview with all 75 people, spent a lot of time on the infusion unit, and in these interviews, I asked people, I kind of defined goals, and then I asked people to list all of their goals. Totally open-ended, it could be as many as they wanted, we wrote them down together. And then I asked people to, of that list, pick their top 3 most important goals and rank them in order of importance. And then I had them answer some questions about those goals. So the goal characteristics there. So I asked them about how doable do you think this goal is? How kind of within your control is this goal? And then I asked them some other questions, but I won't talk about those today. So I asked them about kind of if they thought they were going to make progress towards that goal in the short term, in the long term, et cetera. And so all of the patients recruited to this study were living with advanced lung cancer, so stage 3 or 4, and they were receiving first-line treatment at Moffitt. So here's a brief snapshot of the demographics of the sample. You'll see we did recruit non-small cell and small cell. Most patients had stage 4 disease, and patients were on a bunch of different therapies. All right, so here are our findings. So we found that hope was associated with people who were higher in hope had more meaning and purpose in life and more positive affect, as we would expect. Hope was not associated with emotional well-being, which was kind of a surprise, and it was not associated with negative affect. Hope was positively associated with perceived goal attainability and control over goals. So if you were more hopeful, you were more likely to think that you could achieve your goals and that you had kind of intrinsic ability to control that. So that aligns with hope theory. And then we also found that those goal characteristics were associated with better psychological well-being. All of these domains popped. So here is a screenshot of the goals. I think this is the most interesting part to me. So we took all of the goals that people cited. There were 344 total, and we coded them into domains. And so we identified 8 core domains that you see listed here. And those 2 columns, you see first the number of patients that had at least one goal that went into that domain. And then you see the total number of goals that fell in that domain. So of the total goals, nearly 3/4 of people had at least one social role or relationship goal. So that had something to do with others, right? Being around family, taking care of family and friends and pets, maintaining relationships. Similarly, almost 3/4 of people had at least one leisure pleasure goal, to go on vacation with my family, right? And then interestingly, the kind of next most common type of goal was everyday practical. I want to keep cooking. I want to be able to mow my lawn, right? All of those kind of everyday things. We did have 2 kind of cancer-focused goal domains. We had palliative outcomes, which was really things focused on kind of comfort and quality of life. And then we also had cancer treatment response or disease outcomes. So those are our domains that are really focused on like cure longevity. So when we looked at what people identified as their most important goal, once again, social role dominated, and you have some examples here. So nearly 1/3 of the sample, a social role goal was the most important thing to them. About 1/4 of the sample, a cancer outcome goal was the most important. So cure, to get rid of cancer, to extend life as long as possible. And then that everyday practical shows up again, which I think is always interesting, as the 3rd most common, most important goal. You see a little note here at the bottom that having a cancer-related goal as the most important was negatively associated with emotional well-being, but it was not associated with hope. So what do we make of all that? So I think a lot of this kind of aligns with what hope theory would tell us, right? Hope is associated with how we perceive goals. Hope contributes to positive psychological outcomes. Hope doesn't seem to buffer against negative psychological outcomes, which actually is aligned with theory as well. The idea that you could be a hopeful pessimist, which is kind of counterintuitive, but is true. We know that having valued attainable goals that are within your control is associated with better psychological outcomes, and that having a cancer-related goal as the primary may compromise emotional well-being. And that's likely because a lot of that is outside of our control. So if we're solely focused on that, we might feel really stuck and helpless, right? But as Debbie told us, as her doctor told her, right? You can maintain that as an important goal, but you have to have other things as well, right? And so that's what we find in high hope people, is that they focus their attention on valued attainable goals, even if they maintain, of course, a cancer-related goal is important, but having that breadth of goals seems to be the thing that's really important there. I love this. This was just like in a Healthline article, but I think it summarizes so nicely kind of what this goal literature tells us. when we think about quality of life when living with non-small cell lung cancer. And it says, life shouldn't be all about cancer and cancer treatment. Socialize, hang out with friends, spend time on your hobbies, stay as active and involved as you can, continue to do the things that bring you pleasure, which couldn't align better with Debbie's message. We have published some of these findings, so if you are interested, you can always go check them out. So thinking about some practical strategies to kind of foster or maintain hope, there are some hope-based interventions that really just kind of walk through the steps of hope theory, right? They help us to identify and pursue valued attainable goals, focus on goals particularly that are aligned with what's most important to us, our values. So Debbie talked about her grandbaby, right? Like for most people, those values are the things, those are what keep us going. We're not going through cancer treatment because it's fun. We're doing it because we have these broader goals. And then the importance of identifying a range of hopes or goals and strategies to kind of navigate roadblocks, because not every pathway is going to work out, which Debbie also talked about, right? And then finally, a dialectical approach. This is my shtick. So a dialectic is the idea that two things that seem like opposites can both be true at the same time. So two emotions, two thoughts, right? And I think oftentimes we feel compelled to kind of pick one and block out the other, right? We hear people say all the time, you have to think positive, right? But you can think positive and still have a really hard day and feel scared and tired, right? And so a dialectic tells us you can feel both hopeful and scared. You can experience grief for what is lost or a life that looks different than you'd hoped or planned, and feel immense gratitude for what you do have. Here are two resources that I really love and I share with patients in my clinic all the time. The first one is the values card sort. So this is a kind of fun activity that helps you to sort your values into piles. And so it has values like adventure,